Welcome to everyone who is here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Tracy Fessenden. I'm acting director of the center. I want to welcome those of you who were here with us 2 weeks ago to hear Scott Warren. Those of you who are returnees from that event were eager to talk more about borders. So we are very, very happy to have Beth Hurd with us, whom I'll introduce in just a minute. Today's talk is Heaven Has a Wall, Religion, Spirituality, and Borders with Elizabeth Shakman Hurd. And today's talk, like the Scott Warren event, is part of our Spirituality and Public Life initiative, made possible by a generous donation to the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. The initiative highlights the importance of spirituality to the ethical formation of persons and citizens, and to the institutions of public life that are vital to human flourishing. We have several upcoming events. Next Wednesday, April 8th, please join us at 4:30 in the Biodesign Auditorium for our annual Hart-Nikachos Lecture in Peace Studies, where Jillian Mitchell will be giving a talk called Peace, Humanities, Peace Building Through the Arts. And Jillian is at Edinburgh? Okay, so he's coming a long way to be with us, and I hope that you will join us. Then on the following week, on Tuesday, April 14th at 4:30, please come back here to this room to hear our colleague, Center Assistant Research Professor Anand Gopal, talk about his new book, Days of Love and Rage. And if you've been reading the New York Times Book Review, you might have seen the extraordinary review of this book last week. We're very happy to be his colleagues and to be welcoming him here. And lastly, on Thursday, April 23rd, is our culminating Spirituality and Public Life event. David Walker, Professor of Religious Studies at UC Santa Barbara, will be sharing his documentary, The Mormon Giant, while providing live soundtracking and live narration. And the subtitle of The Mormon Giant is a wrestler, and Mormonism was his gimmick. I guess wrestlers all have a gimmick. And so our theme is wrestling with religion in the 20th century. As always, details about our events can be found on our website, csrc.asu.edu. Recordings of most of our past events can be found on our YouTube channel. And I encourage you to follow us there and on socials, and to sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already. For a little housekeeping, please take a moment to silence or turn off your cell phones. Today's event is also being live streamed, so we welcome those joining us remotely. And for those here in person, I invite you to join us for a light dessert reception served from the adjoining side room following the event. I will start the question and answer portion of the event after Beth's talk with a short moderated conversation, and then we'll open questions up to the audience. Those of you who are here in person may have seen these little question cards as you walked in. As you listen to the evening's discussion, you can jot down a question and pass it to the end of the row for center staff to collect. You're welcome to submit a question in English or Spanish. And if your question is selected and you'd like to read it yourself, indicate that by checking the box. Be sure to put down your name unless you'd like to remain anonymous. For those of you joining us online, you can submit questions at any time during the event by emailing them to us at csrc.asu.edu. And now it gives me it's a very, very real pleasure to introduce our speaker, Elizabeth Shakman Hurd. Beth Hurd is Professor and Chair of Religious Studies and Professor of Political Science, and holds an appointment in the program on Middle East and North African Studies at Northwestern University, where she also co-directs the Global Religion Research Group and manages the Teaching Law and Religion Case Archive. Beth studies religions and politics globally, with a focus on U.S. foreign and immigration policy, American borders, the politics of secularism and religious freedom, and the U.S.-Middle East relationship. And she is also a dear friend of the CSRC and a cherished colleague of long standing. Beth was visiting research professor here at the center in 2010. This was one of her many visiting appointments in all over the world, in Europe and the Americas. She co-edited with Linnell Cady, founding director of the Center, Comparative Secularisms in a Global Age. She is also the author of The Politics of Secularism in International Relations, Beyond Religious Freedom, The New Global Politics of Religion, both published by Princeton. Beth has also done as much public writing as any scholar I know. You can find her in the Chicago Tribune, Al Jazeera America, Boston Review, many, many other venues, and these are deeply researched and accessible essays, not social media hot takes. Her latest book, Heaven Has a Wall, Religion, Borders, and the Global United States, was published by the University of Chicago Press last year and is the inspiration behind today's talk. So please join me in giving Dr. Elizabeth Shakman Hurd a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. That's so sweet. All right, can you all hear me? Is my mic working? Thank you so much for this incredibly warm introduction. This is it's just great to come back to ASU. It was kind of one of the first places I got started in my career is doing that book with Linnell Cady, with Professor Cady, and it was a fantastic way to start. So let's see where we are now. I'm just trying to scooch this down a tiny bit. There we go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the cover to get started of the book. And then its premise, which is kind of the main argument, and I'll get to that, about borders and borderlessness. I'll then move into a couple of examples to illustrate the argument. The first will be on borderlessness for American ranchers and an intensely bordered existence for the Tohono O'odham people. The second example is going to be about the United States and Israel, and about specifically the suspension of borders and that relationship and the formation of a kind of supranational construct that I think helps us to understand what is happening today in the Middle East. Can you hear me? Yes, back everywhere. Okay, because I can raise the volume. And then I'm going to conclude with a couple of words about borders and rivers in order to leave us on a little bit of a more peaceful note. So on a trip to the borderlands, here we are a few years ago. I guess you guys probably don't think of yourself as the borderlands, but coming from Chicago, this seems close. A friend and I visited the Mariposa point of entry, the LPOE, near Nogales, between Arizona and Sonora. Many of you are probably familiar with this border crossing. Wandering through the gardens there, I was struck by the artwork, and I took the photo on the right that day that is now on the cover of the book after a very long and intense dispute with the University of Chicago Press. I'm thinking of adding the picture that they wanted to use as the cover to the talk, just to add a little humor, but I haven't gotten there yet, but I might. So you can see adult and child-sized footprints embedded in the concrete walls. These are bulletproof walls. As if a parent and child had walked together sideways across the walls, up and out of the facility, with the smaller footprints veering off into the sky. Had they died? Had they left the building? Had they left the country? The walls were eerie, and they were also oddly humanizing. They stayed with me, and they stay with me to this day. The Mariposa land point of entry underwent a $250 million renovation some years ago, led by the engineering firm Stantec. A friend of mine from high school happened to work at Stantec. She's a civil engineer, and she connected me with the lead engineer on the renovation, who then introduced me to the head designer, Eddie Jones of Jones Studio. Jones was delighted to chat. He was very excited. He told me about his vision for Mariposa, how many awards they had won for the design, and that he saw it as a point of connection and not division between the two countries. He told me he found inspiration in this poem by Arizona poet laureate Alberto Rios. Let us turn the map until we see clearly. The border is what joins us, not what separates us. Today, this poem is inscribed in a glass partition in the queuing lanes in the lobby. I asked Eddie Jones, I can't do that. It's going to make scary noises. I asked Eddie Jones about the footprints. I was curious about the footprints. I was a little bit obsessed. He said with all these cold, bulletproof walls, his team felt that we needed to tell a story. So a public artist on the team came up with the idea of covering the walls in footprints. The concrete was cast on site and poured horizontally. You can see this here in what is called tilt slab construction. They used real sneakers to imprint the footprints on the walls. When I asked him where the footprints were meant to be going, Jones said, "They're on a journey." In fact, as you know, many more tomatoes pass through Mariposa than people. This is the main entry point for 60% of all winter produce consumed in the United States. The total value of exports and imports passing through annually is roughly $35 billion. For tomatoes, the border is open. So this is Mariposa, public art venture, trade hub, tomato point of entry, welcoming oasis, borders and borderlessness, poetry and prisons, gardens and guards, fountains and fear, welcome and walls. This is the United States. And there is something paradoxical about this project and about our borders, an American desire to have borders, but also to transcend them, to enforce the law and to suspend it when we see fit, to be first among equals, to make the rules, but not quite be subject to them. Americans can build the Panama Canal, bring democracy to the Middle East, conquer outer space, innovate our way out of climate catastrophe, revise the international order at will, and make border crossing as pleasant as a trip to an art museum. The authors of the 9/11 report captured this American political imaginary. The American homeland, they wrote, is the planet. If I could just have one sentence that sums up the whole book, that's kind of it right there. So you can go to sleep now, and I'll wake you up when we get to the Gilded Age. Studying borders only reinforced my sense of limitless confinement, expansive claustrophobia, the border as a site of retrenchment and transcendence, enforcement and erasure. The US violently defends its borders, we all know that, even as the ideal of America remains borderless. This paradox, of course, is not new in US history. We can go back to the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas, expansion into California, debates over annexing Cuba, a long list of other places that we've annexed or colonized. And today it's Greenland, it's Venezuela, it's Canada. I haven't checked my phone in the last 20 minutes. There's probably another place that we're ready to annex. I'm afraid it won't be Iran, I can tell you that. So I wanted to know, what is holding this all together? How can we think about this? And I landed on the idea that borders draw a person into something bigger, like politics and religion, my areas of study. They draw you in. The stakes are high. They involve bodies, mortality, and sovereignty. In her wonderful book, Consuming Religion, Katie Lofton wrote that, as you see here, religion isn't only something you join open-hearted and confessing. It's not only something you inherit, it's the thing into which you become ensnared despite yourself. I found borders to be like that. They ensnare you. You don't get to choose where you're born. The agent holds your passport, sometimes very literally. This gives me a little chance to talk about the organization of the book. It has several very short interludes, just a few pages long each, that are meant for students and non-specialists. They come in between each of the chapters as a little breather, a little space. They are stories. They're true stories. And one of them is called Crossing, and it's about my own border crossing at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, where I was interviewed by an agent who was just back from the border in Texas. After chatting for a moment, he asked me what I did. I avoided the R word, religion, as one has to do. I've learned that lesson. And I told him I study US borders. Bad plan. His posture turned very aggressive. He told me that media reports about detained children in cages that summer were, quote, all lies. Our conversation took place a few days after his employer, the Department of Homeland Security, had released a damning report documenting horrific conditions for children on the border in Texas, with photos of children in cages. This interlude invites readers to think about crossing, to think hard about crossing, your own crossings, those of family, your friends. Who has to show a passport? Who leaves it in their bag? Who gets interrogated, thrown into airport prison detention, and who goes through a special entrance with a lounge with whiskey and little salads that might give you food poisoning? What if you cross without realizing it or intending to cross and you can't get back in? This happened this January 2026 to a university at Buffalo research scientist, Shovgi Husseinov, who tried to turn his car around but accidentally crossed the Peace Bridge and was detained by the US for weeks in Batavia, New York, and then in Michigan. Borders can be terrifying. There's an element of the Inquisition in crossing. The border agent and the medieval inquisitor are not as far apart as they might seem. Borders are also sites of enchantment and mystery. Can you go back once you've crossed? Will you be the same person when you do? Borders invite us to imagine other possibilities for the organization of time, space, and authority. Ironically, the border's weighty presence calls us to imagine the possibility of its absence. The book then is organized around 4 aspects of US borders: creating, enforcing, suspending, and refusing. I'm going to turn now to a story from a time when the US-Mexico border was being created. Some of you may know some of this story. The idea is to show how US borders operated since the very beginning of the founding of the country to confine some and not others. Let's go back then to the 19th century, near where we are now, Arizona and Sonora, and 2 communities contrasting experiences of the US-Mexico border. This is a story of possession and dispossession, of land grabs that unite cattle herds and separate families, of economic and political power, of ranchers, railroads on one side, and on the other side, dislocation, dispossession of the people who've lived in this area for thousands of years. The US, as you know, is a recent presence in this region in a historical sense. US control began with the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the 1853 Gadsden Purchase. The Gadsden Purchase divided traditional Tohono O'odham lands between the US and Mexico. The line drawers did not consult the tribe at the time, and most of them did not even know that a border had been drawn. They traveled, passing back and forth, as they had for time immemorial, across what had overnight become an international boundary. In the late 19th century, this easy crossing changed. The US started to intensify their border enforcement. Why? Because of economic interests and the desire to govern and to surveil these territories more intensively. The result was that the O'odham were separated from their families and lands on the other side. In 1916, President Wilson established a permanent reservation, which you can see on the slide in red, for the O'odham, and erected the very first US-Mexico border fence. It's remarkable that it's really just 110 years since that first fence went up, because the wall today feels in some ways eternal. So the bottom line is the O'odham lost a lot of land in the 19th century. You can see that on this map. One historian notes that although some of them took jobs as cowboys with Mexican and American ranching outfits and began to be integrated as wage earners into the lower rungs of the economy, the broad picture was one of land loss, diminished to 1/10 of its original size. Today, the Tohono O'odham Reservation spans 2.7 million acres. It's now the 2nd largest reservation in the US and is roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. The O'odham now share sovereignty with the US government. In 1974, Congress established the Shadow Wolves, an all-native border patrol who are assigned to Homeland Security. The Shadow Wolves are at the top of their game. They have trained border guards, customs officials, and police in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. They are part of a global web of US borders that I hope people will start to see, rather than thinking of the US as just bordered with Canada and Mexico, but rather we're talking about a web of borders that is a much more accurate representation. Last year, Congress passed the Shadow Wolves Improvement Act, making them special agents and giving them the right to carry firearms and make arrests, including immigration-related arrests. Many O'odham have mixed feelings about this cooperation. Local indigenous organizations, such as the O'odham Legislative Council, Indigenous Alliance Without Borders, the voice against the wall, and indivisible Tohono, among others, protest the environmental, political, and spiritual costs of the border, militarizing and dividing their communities. The San Miguel Gate, which you see here, some of you may have seen it in person, was once a passageway to and from Mexico created only for the Odom people, not for other citizens of the US or Mexico. It is now closed due to private land ownership on the Mexican side after a series of disputes that I discuss in the book. This is the Odom side of the story. Let me turn to the other side. In the very same era, we have US ranchers coming to buy up huge tracts of land in the American Southwest on both sides of the border. Their experience of the border was rather different. At the same time that borders were being enforced at the expense of the Odom, the same border was being openly circumvented by wealthy capitalist ranchers seeking to invest in the Mexican side of a booming trans-border capitalist economy. It's the show. It was literally the Gilded Age. Although a zoning law prohibited foreigners from owning land near the border, investors found a workaround. They made the border disappear as if by magic. How did they do this? They invoked corporate nationality. They became corporations under Mexican law, granting them all of the economic advantages of Mexican citizenship without having to give up their status as US citizens. Historian Rachel St. John explains, under Mexican law, any company, as you see here, incorporated under the laws of Mexico carried all rights of citizenship save voting. By forming a Mexican corporation, American ranching capitalists legally transcended the limitations of US citizenship, overriding US sovereignty, even as they also enacted their own forms of mini sovereignty over their ranches that extended across the border. So when it came to business interests across the line, as far as the investors were concerned, the US was borderless. Corporate entities owned by Americans and incorporated under Mexican law were Mexican corporate nationals. The legal fiction of corporate personhood joined with the impulse of American expansionism and the license of transnational capital to overwrite assertions of sovereignty by the Mexican state and the Odom nation. Among those taking advantage of Mexican corporate nationality was Texas John Slaughter, a cattleman and Wild West sheriff who came to Arizona in the 1870s. I've kind of gone down a rabbit hole that none of this is in the book, but it was a thing with this guy. Once I started watching this show, wait till you hear about this. They made a Disney TV series, 1958 to 1961, about Texas John Slaughter. The opening theme song, which you can watch on YouTube, of course, included the lines, Texas John Slaughter made them do what they oughta, and if they didn't, they died. It's pretty clear. So he served 2 terms as sheriff of Cochise County, during which he helped to track the famous warrior Geronimo, an Apache opponent of the conquest of the Southwest. There's a lot to be said there, but I don't have time for that. In 1884, he bought the San Bernardino Ranch. Some of you may have been there. I have yet to go. It's a 65,000-acre property spanning the Arizona-Sonora border. The 1853 Gadsden Treaty drew the international boundary straight through Slaughter's ranch, leaving 1/3 of it in Arizona and 2/3 in Sonora. So Slaughter set up his headquarters on the line. And not only did his cattle graze back and forth at will across the border, but the ranch became a way station for cattle that Slaughter bought from Sonoran ranchers and sold at an enormous profit to American consumers. He built a landscape of private property and real estate market on both sides of the border. The scale was very impressive. By the end of the 19th century, the animals moving through his ranch joined hundreds of thousands of cattle grazing on both sides of the border. In 1887, just one ranch, the San Rafael, operated by brothers Collin and Brewster Cameron, just east of Nogales, ran a herd of more than 17,000 cattle. The US and Mexican governments facilitated, they didn't oppose, they facilitated this transition to private land ownership. This led to the appropriation of millions of acres of land that were inhabited, used, or claimed by Native Americans and other borderlands people, like the Yaquis and the Otham. They were hit the hardest. American-owned Mexican corporations became linchpins in a trans-border economy. And by 1910, US investors dominated mining, ranching, irrigation, and real estate speculation. Remarkably, my favorite statistic, Americans own most of the land on both sides of the border at this time. In 1964, Slaughter was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners of the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Today, his ranch is a National Historic Landmark 15 miles east of Douglas, Arizona. The only mention of the existence of tribal nations by the Park Service and on, separately, the historical marker database at the ranch refers to a threat posed by Apache raids. In this version of history, quote, Apache Indian raids throughout the region prevented the Spanish from building a garrison in the 1770s and forced a Mexican rancher to abandon his land in the 1830s. But in the 1880s, an American rancher and Wild West sheriff, John H. Slaughter, settled San Bernardino with his family and founded a successful cattle ranch, end quote. So this is the Park Service, right? At the same time, the Otham were encountering a newly established and emboldened border patrol led by none other than Texas John Slaughter's former Cochise County Sheriff's Office employee, Jim Milton. In accordance with U.S. policy, Milton refused to acknowledge tribal rights to cross the border. His former boss, however, did not only cross the border, he owned it. Okay, that's that story. Borders are zones of transition, crossing over, intensification of authority, and a simultaneous diminution. They can even be selectively suspended, as you saw with the ranchers. My second story also involves playing with borders and sovereignty. This time, and we're changing gears, so bear with me, this time in a formation that I call America-Israel. One word. I had always wanted to explore the cultural foundations of relations between the United States and Israel. The time finally came when I could write about these issues without losing my job. I have 3 kids, and they're basically more or less all in college, so can't lose the job. I want to begin by acknowledging the profound importance of the Holocaust, as well as the military-industrial complex in explaining U.S. support for Israel. But I want to tell a story that is perhaps less familiar, the story of a cultural, religious, and political imaginary that at times appears to unite the United States and Israel as if they were one country, one supranation, America-Israel, one word. If you can think of the European Union and how the countries come together and pool their sovereignty and share it together, you can think about America-Israel in these terms. The fact that we don't share a land border makes it harder to imagine, but just come with me on the ride and see what you think. Seen in these flags, we have America-Israel. On the one hand, we have America-Israel as peace, right? The flag on the left. On the other, we have a vaguely anti-Semitic flag, which of course we're playing here with philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. The Israeli flag is kind of hiding behind the US, such that when you pull back the US, what do you find? The Israeli flag controlling the US, standing behind it. So I have shown this several times and had people tell me that they're shocked by this flag. Jewish folks telling me that this is a very anti-Semitic flag. So I want to put that as a marker there. And we're going to come back to anti-Semitism. America-Israel is a collective commitment, set of beliefs, set of inclinations, set of affects, feelings, and emotions that trades in a lot of interesting and important American cultural tendencies. Military prowess, fascination with the Holy Land, the overcoming of borders, the transcendence of self, a sense of civilizational triumph over darkness, whether it is Native Americans at home or Muslims in the Middle East. These political, religious, cultural, and, as I will argue, commercial investments lend themselves to an eschatological foreign policy, a foreign policy for the end times. America-Israel not only invokes Christian and Jewish religious and political ideals, as important and influential as they are, but a wide spectrum of American nationalist fantasies. It banks on Americans' historical, topographical, religious, and commercial fascination with the Holy Land, a fascination that exceeds Christian and Jewish Zionisms. This fascination with the Holy Land, it's very important to note, predates 1948 and the founding of the State of Israel. The US public consensus in support of Israel that gathered strength after 1967 was led by organized political expressions of Christian Zionism buoyed by corporate and military interests. Support for Israel, then commingling theological and political justifications, became then and remains today the norm. I'd like to now bring us closer to the ground with an example that shaped how I think about the suspension of the US border with Israel. I want to suggest that this border suspension is bound up and tied into the suspension of the border between Zionism and Judaism, so that in this view, to be or become American is to be or become a Zionist. Has anyone heard of the Holy Land Experience theme park? You been there? No? They're laughing. No? Okay. A couple of weeks ago, I gave an online talk to a seminar at Yale, and one of the young ladies in the class told me that she grew up across the street from there. So I have to ask now. Holy Land Experience was a family theme park in Orlando, Florida. It opened in 2001, and it closed during the pandemic. It was usually described as a Christian Disneyland, combining popular Christianity, commerce, entertainment, pilgrimage, food, and politics. Small p, kind of under the rug. The park featured a romanticized and commercialized replica of the real thing, meaning a 15-acre simulation recreating the ancient city of Jerusalem in first-century Judea. An actor playing Jesus, who you see on the left, wandered the grounds. Live animals populated the manger. It was like a petting zoo for children. Trinity Broadcasting purchased the park and installed the Trinity mini golf course. I know, it's not up there. It's not, I can't even go there. To my initial surprise, though less so upon reflection, and here's the point of this, the park also included a form of collective reverence for the state of Israel. Their online store had an entire section called Judaica, which I eagerly opened to discover an Israeli flag for sale in 3 sizes, the largest 60 by 90 inches for $40. Its description read, quote, "The flag of Israel with a Star of David between 2 horizontal stripes, all in a dark sky blue on a white background, is the perfect standard to display at your home or church to show your love and support for the land and its people." Other product categories in the Judaica section included olive wood, menorahs, mezuzahs, talits, and, quote, instruments. Holy Land Experience went out of business during the pandemic, but Holy Land Gifts and any other number of websites online will sell you all of these items and many more. 2 quick examples. The Allies flag, Isaiah 62:1, is shown here. A commingling of Israeli flags, US flags, and Jewish ritual objects that boggles the mind. The map of Israel olive wood mezuzah may look like someone out to make a buck, but I think it reinforces subtly but strongly the idea that Jews belong in Israel and the Holy Land, rather than other parts of the Middle East, in North Africa, or anywhere else in the world. This collapse of Judaism with the state of Israel by placing the Israeli flag in the category of Judaica suggests that to be American in this commercialized supranational flag world is to stand with and for the state of Israel, the state for Jews. This is among the everyday ways in which American cultural investments in the Holy Land are laundered gently and comfortably into commercial interest in Judaica and then into political support for the state of Israel. You might say, well, that's fine. And maybe it is. But the power of these commitments is being felt in the widespread adoption by governments, states, and universities, including my own, of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA for short, IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. What is IHRA? This is what my dean asked me when the university adopted it. He said, I've never heard of this. Can you tell me what this is? The IHRA is a 38-word quasi-legal statement characterized by immense vagueness that has become the central tool in a major legal redefinition of anti-Semitism in US law and policy and public life. The definition includes 11 illustrations, 7 of which highlight critical statements and assessments of Israel as markers of anti-Semitism. IRA is being used as a legal benchmark for defining anti-Semitism and as an instrument of political and religious control. It has a growing presence in state and federal law. According to IRA, certain forms of critique of the State of Israel are anti-Semitic and must be reported to the federal authorities for investigation. For years, organizations like the Anti-Defamation League have sought to redefine anti-Semitism to force criticism of Zionism or of the policies of the State of Israel into the dictionary meaning of anti-Semitism, racism against Jewish people. The implication, as Professor Sari Makdizi notes, is that when the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, tallies up reports of anti-Semitism on campus or warns of spikes in anti-Semitism across the country, warnings that are picked up, read at face value, and amplified by the New York Times, it is deliberately impossible to distinguish instances of actual anti-Jewish hatred from protests against Israel's war in Gaza. It may surprise you to hear that America-Israel also trades in anti-Semitism itself. This is expressed in an inability and unwillingness to fully incorporate Jews into the American project. In this dark logic, Jews are depicted as a racial and religious other that invite attraction, repulsion, hierarchy, and dominance. They belong over there in Israel in this narrative. This is the America-Israel of the extreme right, which controls the US federal government and supports borders that ban and pin people into categories, territories, and identities with enormous violence. In this vision, an unassimilable Jewishness subsists within what is presumed to be a white Christian nation. Religious studies scholar J. Cameron Carter describes this as an inclusionary supersessionism that engulfs the Jewish people in the whiteness of the West. Jews are not replaced, they are absorbed and redefined within this dominant framework. Incorporating Jews into Western humanism, says Carter, aligns Jewishness with whiteness and colonial practice. In short, TLDR, white supremacy runs quietly just below the surface of America-Israel. What about people who dissent from America-Israel? Protests of the war in Gaza were also about the conflation of Judaism with Zionism. For these protesters, to be Jewish is not necessarily to be Zionist. To be American is not necessarily to be Zionist. To put this in the terms of the Holy Land shopping experience, the category of Judaica does not automatically include the flag of Israel. There are other Judaisms. There are other ways. There are other paths. The protesters subscribe to other moral and political possibilities beyond the nationalization of Judaism. As Jewish studies scholar and Rabbi Shaul Magid wrote, what we are asking is how to understand the collapse of a half century of Judaism's fusion with Zionism, not to argue for or against it as much as to explore a post-consensus reality. So I'm almost done. The protests in 2024 were about disentangling Zionism and Jewishness. They were also about Gaza, Christianity, race, American nationalism, and, my point, the right to dissent from the political religion of the governments of the United States and Israel, the right to dissent from America-Israel. For the government, the protesters' convictions were neither a religion that deserved legal protection nor an acceptable form of political dissent. I know many of the students in this room are taking classes on religious freedom. This is an interesting case study. These protesters were, and we still are, called heretics, terrorists, and anti-Semites. I want to conclude now on a lighter note, a different note, with a word about rivers and borders. This is from the conclusion of the book. I've never spoken about it in a talk before. But here you're looking at what is called a meander map of the Rio Grande. In the preface to her wonderful book, The Ideal River, Joanne Yao wrote, "The dream of taming rivers wove through the history of the modern world like a bright thread, lurking in a desire for neatness, predictability, finite boundaries, and a straightened sense of political purpose. The ideal river," she explains, "was meant to serve as a rational and reliable highway for the seamless movement of goods, people, and ideas that enriches the state, enlightens the populace, and brings liberal progress. The proper use of science and technology would allow for human mastery of nature and nature's contingencies. The ideal river and the ideal border have much in common. As modern architects and river planners sought to tame and regularize rivers, so have policymakers sought to tame and regularize borders. The dream of taming borders, like that of taming rivers, weaves through the history of the modern world like a bright thread. And yet, also like rivers, borders are unwieldy and unpredictable. They're deterritorialized. Human control is partial, undecided, incomplete. They are exceptional sites of efforts to escape the ordinary, to find spaces outside of law, beyond ourselves, places of emancipation and even chosenness. More than a physical frontier, they are fixed and open, fortified and deferred, legalized and exceptionalized, sacred and secular. That's the river. So, more peaceful note. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. Now we'll sit together and chat for a few minutes. And I've been watching Margaret Gooch and Friends for signals when I am audible and when I'm not. So I'm still watching you. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Beth, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. I imagine those of you who signed up for the talk and saw the publicity that we made available, who had not read Beth's book before coming today, might have been caught somewhat short by the pivot to America-Israel. And so I want to just talk about that with you a little bit more. One of the terms that I know our colleague Alex Savinia uses, and you were very familiar with it when we were chatting just outside, the Palestinian-Mexican border as a conceptual border between those who are entitled to dignity and sovereignty and those who are deemed not entitled, those who are bound by borders and those who control borders. How can we, the term Palestine-Mexico border or Palestinian-Mexican border suggests that we can think these together. We can think these stories together. So I would like to invite you to just say a little bit more to help us think them together after your talk today.
Yes, thank you. I'll try not to move so I don't make scary noises. So the Palestine-Mexico border is not my term. This is a term, though, that's helpful because, as you were saying, Tracy, it helps us to see something that we may not have seen otherwise. Because we have in our minds, we've been socialized and trained and taught since we were little kids to see the world and to see it divided into maps that have borders between different states and the US and Canada and the US and Mexico and, and so on and so forth. So we're not particularly attuned to the possibility that there are a lot of other borders that are also operating at the same time, either aligned with or disaligned with the territorial boundaries that we are so familiar with. So the Palestine-Mexico border is the idea, as you put very nicely, of a kind of hierarchy of humanity in which certain people are understood as exercising sovereignty and as having the right to enforce, to draw the borders in the first place and then to enforce them or to supersede them and suspend them at will. And that's an important part of what I'm suggesting here. It's not only drawing and enforcing, it's also the ability to suspend them, to work with them, to play with them. And these borders are very fungible. They can be moved, they can shift. So it's a complicated process. But we have to think about this. So it's not only just the sovereign, those who can hold sovereignty and those who can't. It's also the interconnectedness between these locations. And here we're talking about a political economy of bordering. Basically, and you can think of the military-industrial complex, think of a border-industrial complex, an entire infrastructure, a set of webs that circles over the globe and is interconnected in complex ways, all of which is about enforcing where people can move, where they can't move, who can move out of that space, who can move into a different space, and who's trapped in it. Because we think of borders as, well, I have to cross the border, I'll show my passport. In many situations, for most people in the world, probably 80 to 90%, borders keep you in. Why? Because you don't have the means to buy the visa. you are forbidden crossing the border, and so on and so forth. So there's this web, this entire global infrastructure of borders that I'm trying to point to. Now, who's in charge of that web? Who enforces it? If you want to look at the Palestine-Mexico border example, we're talking about the American and Israeli governments. We're talking about the institutions of both governments, but we're also talking about a very powerful political economy. You've probably heard of Israel referred to as Startup Nation. In the Tour de France, their team is called Startup Nation, right? So these startups, many, not all, many of them are working on technologies related to border enforcement and surveillance, governance of Palestinians. Those technologies, once they're up and running, are, quote, this is the language of Elbit Systems, one of the big Israeli contractors, not my language. They're, quote, field tested on Palestinians, and then they are brought to the Arizona and other parts of the United States, but very specifically, since we're in Arizona, the Arizona borderlands, and they are used. I'm talking about surveillance towers, I'm talking about robots that eventually there may be robot dogs that are able to shoot. We're talking about all kinds of very powerful forms of surveillance that are technologies that are basically used by America, Israel. And I'm not saying this as a kind of conspiracy theory. It's actually, you know, we can look at the documents, we can look at the facts, we can look at the corporations, you can see them. They are Israeli subsidiaries. The Americans bring the Israeli experts here to Arizona, and they have cooperation and training, and then the US government, mainly DHS, will purchase those technologies and put them in place. So the Palestine-Mexico border might sound fantastical or delusional, or like someone got very confused on their 4th grade geography exam. And it's not. It is the reality that the world that we live in, there actually is such a thing, and there are the same actors and the same dynamics, and they know each other, and they work together, and they are creating these borders together. And that is why we kind of use that term. Now, that's just one example. There are so many examples. And so, you know, I'm happy to discuss other parts of the world. Tibet is fascinating, for example. For those of you who are interested in that part of the world, there are many, many other examples that we could go into.
Thank you. After reading your the introduction to your book, I was moved to look up the definition of anti-Semitism promoted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, which now Northwestern has adopted. Many universities have adopted. Many many organizations have adopted.
Has Arizona adopted it? Do you know?
I don't think so. Evan's saying no. All right. Well, it's here it is, and it is so strategically vague.
It's very, very vague.
That it well, here it is. Okay. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, so we can see, we are aware, all of us, of real violence against Jewish institutions, against Jewish groups. But if you parse the definition, it could be perceptions that are at fault. It could be actions against non-Jews. I mean, pretty much anything can come under this.
And the examples are usually what people point to, the illustrations, which of the 11, I believe 7 of them collapse, critique of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So the illustrations are where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in this definition, and where the kind of historical and political expose that I'm offering here could be construed under that definition because it is critical of both America and Israel as anti-Semitic.
And so this definition creates a reality where criticism of the conduct of Israel in Gaza amounts to anti-Semitism, for which universities can be fined, as Northwestern was recently fined, $75 million for students protesting the war in Gaza. So I was thinking about how the idea that becomes entrenched here is that to criticize Israel, whatever its conduct, amounts to anti-Semitism, amounts to criticism of Jewish people, is similar to the idea that we see coming from those who would defend ICE agents and ICE activities that, well, if you are not against immigrants, to be American, you have to be against immigrants. If you are pro-immigrant, then you are anti-America, and you just have to pick sides, right? So I was thinking as I was reading something of yours recently, Beth, that the straw man of this hard right view is always like a 17-year-old kid on Reddit who says something unfortunate, right? Says something unconsidered or provocative, and then that becomes a meme that stands in for the progressive view or the left-wing view. And then what is the position that Homeland Security and ICE are combating? It's this extreme position that no one in public office has ever espoused. Right. So this got me thinking, okay, what Beth and I were saying last night, we met in either the first or second Obama administration, the first.
I think it was first.
Yeah, the first we figured out. And how before that, under Republican presidents, Reagan and both Bushes, immigration was considered a good thing. You know, it really was a good thing.
Good for business.
And well, good for business, right? But even, and then during the Obama administration, where we saw the wonderful words of our colleague Alberto Rios about borders being what unite us, not what divide us, there was just a very different vibe, right, about immigration. So my question, and this is a little bit of a pivot, is what if it is the kid on Reddit or the unfortunate tweet that then defines what the wrong view is? How has social media played into some of what you're describing? Because we just didn't have these viral forms of othering, these viral forms of communication in these earlier Republican administrations or in the Obama administration. So is there, what do you see? What have you observed about the role of social media and what you're describing?
Sadly, I see social media as inflaming tendencies, which have always been there. I mean, Obama had the moniker deporter-in-chief, right? I mean, he did a lot of deportations. And he did it in a different way, and it was not equivalent to what we're seeing today, so I don't want to make false equivalencies. But I feel like social media is inflaming what we've always had. There's always been people on the margins, and now they're just having, this heyday, right? Being able to reach such broad audiences so quickly. I am not a scholar of communications, though, so it's a little bit, out of my area. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's changed that much. I guess you're saying that it's platforming extremists in a way that it didn't before. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, it sort of sorts us always. We're always being sorted into opposing camps, and so there's a binary divide that's being
Weren't we
forced
always being
well,
sorted?
I'm just thinking about the earlier 2000s, late 1990s, 1980s views of immigration accepted a kind of porousness that was not threatening, right? Was not seen as threatening, and then somehow the border has to come back into play as a boundary, not necessarily between landforms, right? But the boundary between who gets to set the rules and who has to abide by them, right? And so that sorting mechanism, I think, is what we're seeing more of, and more. It just seems to work so quickly and so.
Yeah, I have to say that just from my experience working on this book, it seems to me that those mechanisms and those kind of extreme mechanisms of sorting, to use your word, which I love, have always been with us. It just depends on where you look. So just to give one quick example, some of you may recall that for something like 15, 17, someone in the room might know the exact number, years, the US would not allow anyone who was HIV positive into this country. And it was just categorical. This created a great deal of havoc. But this was a very extreme form of sorting. And so to me, where you look historically, you can look at the braceros, you can look at mass deportations in the mid-20th century or early 20th century. There are various moral panics that took place around the Mexican Revolution, for example, and the fear of unionizing, the fear of labor, the fear of union rights and workers' rights at that time. There have been a lot of panics. I don't think that they're not maybe as public, or they're not as well known as what we're seeing today. So it is, I hear you. I think there is a difference. But I think the underlying dynamics of the sorting and the controlling have been with us since the founding, in my experience.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up. You know, as I was thinking about this divide that you speak of between those who, not necessarily the border itself as divide, but the divide between those who get to float over the border, float through the border, not be bound by the border, and those who are constrained by the border.
Yeah.
It reminded me so much of religious freedom talk in America, right? I mean, the International Religious Freedom Act binds every nation on earth to certain norms of religious freedom, but doesn't bind the U.S. The U.S. is the enforcer, but it's not bound by these rules. That, of course, not right. How would we enforce the rules if we were also bound by them? So I just, since you are an expert on religious freedom, I wondered if you didn't use the R word as often as you might have in this talk, but would you like to say more about how religion fits in, or religious freedom fits into the work you're doing on the border, or is that a different conversation?
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I think, well, you just identified one of the most important ways was this pattern of the U.S. writing rules and then exempting itself from those rules, which, you know, you have to enforce sovereignty, except for if we decide that you don't, and then we can go in and do what we like. And religious freedom follows that imperial dynamic to a T. I have to say, though, that one reason I chose this topic is because it is so far away from religious freedom, because religious freedom was kind of driving me up the wall, making me a little bit crazy. Like the walls, the room was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The religious freedom the space of religious freedom became so tight and constricted as a place to be and to think and to work that I very intentionally and often publicly left the discussion of religious freedom, because I was absolutely tired of being typecast as the person who was, quote, against religious freedom, when actually, of course, I was neither for it nor against it. I was diagnosing a very powerful way of understanding the world that, to me, brought together questions around religion and difference in governance and law and politics and international politics, my own area of training, in this really fascinating way. And so it was initially very tantalizing and fun. And then as I lived through what most people think of as religious freedom in American foreign policy, I found there was no oxygen in the room anymore, because my way of thinking about these issues was completely foreign and completely kind of steamrolled over by this gigantic tank of American power and male and white supremacy. It was basically a massive civilizing mission. Let's go civilize the natives. We'll tell them how to be free. We'll tell them how to be religious. And if you don't agree with us, you are, and I'll quote one of my reviewers from my book, Beyond Religious Freedom, bringing down Western civilization, which I took as a compliment.
Beth had a special nickname for the Beyond Religious Freedom project by the end.
My book, yeah, BARF, BRF, Beyond Religious Freedom. That's what I call it now. I'm like, do we have any copies of BARF? I say to my husband, I don't know.
It is a brilliant book, but yes,
Well,
what you describe when you are trying to be nuanced and thoughtful about something that most people just see as an unimpeachable good. You get
apple
into.
pie and baseball.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, we have a question on a card here. I see Sam is bringing up a couple of more. This is from ASU student Alana Rothel, who asks, you said that the American fascination with the Holy Land preceded the State of Israel. Mm-hmm. But when would you say that America-Israel came to be? When and how did our fascination transform, our fascination with the Holy Land, which is arguably pretty old,
quite old,
transform into
very
what we
old.
have today?
Such a good question. I kind of had to jump over so much because of time. 1967, I have to say, if we're going to pick a time, it's going to be 1967. A whole series of dynamics then, which led to a very different configuration in which the U.S. had threw its weight very powerfully, military, economically, political, its weight behind the State of Israel in a way that it had not to the same extent. Although we were the first nation to recognize Israel when it was founded, we had not thrown ourselves behind Israel to the extent that we did after the '67 war. That was also a time when we started to see the rise of very powerful military industrial interests We also saw the rise of what's now called Christian Zionism, which a term I don't like. I think it's kind of like religious freedom. It's just too easy and sweet and tasty and simple, and it like papers over a lot of complicated things. So, but there definitely it was a very powerful movement, I would say, not only of Jewish Zionism, but other forms of Zionism, both Christian and I would say American Zionisms. And of course, those are overlapping categories, all of them, Jewish, Christian, American, complex forces and interwoven tendencies. So I'm kind of being very crass here, but 67 and onwards. And you know, this is, again, the idea is not really new, but I'm proposing what's different is that most analysts who talk about the US and Israel, they talk about, in American foreign policy circles, it's the Israel lobby. You'll even hear that term being talked about right now. There was a recent, the director of counterterrorism just resigned last week, and he resigned because he said the Israel lobby was responsible for the US invasion of Iran, the bombing that's ongoing right now, and that he was not comfortable with that and that he resigned. So those are the kinds of terms that we usually hear. I'm very skeptical and want to be very careful around all of those kinds of terms because I think that they can be very sloppy and imprecise. So I'm really interested in this project and doing something a little different where I'm opening up to a much longer standing set of commitments that Americans have had to the Holy Land long before it was Israel. And I explore some of them in much more detail, not just the Holy Land experience, but a couple of other examples in the book to try to sort of get the texture of those commitments and this understanding of America as the Promised Land and the Holy Land and this covenantal kind of mission that the US shares with Israel. But it's almost seen as like we were here, you know, we were the Holy Land. We were, other than the original Holy Land, America was the Holy Land. There are books, entire books on this, imagining America as the Holy Land. And I'd love to teach a class just on that topic. Actually, I'm hoping to do that at some point. Because I think that there's really something there. And this gets translated then into these, you know, commercial arenas and kind of, you know, flags and affective, different genres, TV shows, movies, all over the place in ways that are not just about, you know, the Washington-Israel lobby. These are like very masculinist way of talking about it in IR, in international relations and US foreign policy. And part of the reason I left, or I've taken a big step further away from those fields, because I want to see a bigger field. I want to paint on a bigger canvas. And so this is an opportunity to try to do that, and also to avoid reproducing some of these kind of very bordered and bounded ideals and ideas about people and their identities. So, you know, Jews support Israel. No, stop. Like, we're human beings. You know, we're in a complicated world. Let's pull back. Let's try to understand a broader context and let people think for themselves a little bit more. Because I think that we're being pushed a lot of times into to identify in certain ways. And that's by both the left and the right. So this is kind of an equal opportunity critique.
We have a question from Taha Saeed, who would like to read the question yourself. Yeah?
Hi, Taha.
Appreciate it. So I think this is a bit of a simple question. You kind of already touched on it, but I imagine it has a very complicated answer. And so you mentioned how America-Israel categorically categorizes everyone, even Jewish people that don't really identify with Zionism. So who does this hegemony primarily serve, if not for Jewish people or American people or Christian people, et cetera, et cetera? Huh?
Yeah, it serves a very particular set of interests that right now in our current configuration of political power is represented by Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump. They have, and you know, Bibi Netanyahu is fighting for his life, his political life. If he did not continue this war or advance this war, or prosecute this war, it's unclear whether, you know, there would be an election, and he probably wouldn't be elected. He's wildly unpopular by a lot of people's estimation in Israel right now. So yeah, I think it's a worldview in which people fit into very clean and clear racial, gender, religious categories, and you adhere to those categories, and you live in your territory, It's kind of an ethnic cleansing mentality. So if you look like this, it's a little bit Samuel Huntington, which is kind of old school. You may not have heard of him. If not, that's fine. Don't look him up. Not worth your time. So Samuel Huntington had a famous phrase in his world politics bestseller book that we all had to read in the 90s in grad school that said, if you don't, he said, this is a direct quote, if you don't know who you are or where you belong, look in the mirror. So basically, it was racialized world order. And Islam has bloody borders was another famous quote from Sam Huntington. So that kind of mentality, where you're mapping ethnicity, religion, race onto particular territories and drawing boundaries around those territories. Israel is for the Jews. America is for, you fill in the blank. I think that whole mentality, this bordered mentality, is terrifying. And, this is the mentality of white supremacism. We see it very clearly in the Proud Boys, and we know, there's no secret here about who's behind this administration. And the degree of anti-Semitism is terrifying. And I also think that it's important to say that it's important to think about the extent to which anti-Semitism is going to be exacerbated by all of these efforts to fight anti-Semitism, which I know you mentioned the 75 million in Northwestern. I just wanted to say, I don't know that it's accurate to even say that that's a payment because of the Gaza protests. I think that they're after us because they don't want critical thought. They don't want people to teach classes that teach about history and about the complexities of human societies and the variety of different life ways that people espouse across time and place. They don't want that. So it's much bigger than Gaza. It's about an image of what it is to be American and what it is in this nation. It's not to put Gaza aside and say it's not important. Of course it's important. Of course the people in the encampments care immensely and deeply about Gaza. But this punishment, this extortion, this blackmail, this is about something bigger. And they told us they were going to do this. They said professors are the enemy. How many years ago? 7, 8 years ago. Professors are the enemy. And all of us were like, ha, that's very funny. Like, we're so powerless. We just teach our class. We're not important. We don't, It's sort of like me bringing down Western civilization. But it's nonetheless, like, they're after us. And I think that that's something we have to reckon with that's much, much bigger, even for people who maybe don't have a dog in the fight around America-Israel. It's a great question. And you're right, complicated answer.
Okay, one more question from an ASU student. Our ASU students are really showing up. This is from Sati. Sati, hi. And the question is, how would you give a counter argument against your book? So I might add to that and say, a fair counter argument. We can think of a long list of unfair counter arguments. But is there
that's such an interesting question.
Is there a fair counter argument to what you're saying?
My book is in a way an exercise of political imagination, Sati. It's an incitement or an invitation to think about things that we take for granted and just turn them and look at them a little differently. So I don't know that there'd be one counter argument. There might be an argument I could see someone saying, oh, well, borders are borders. They're firm, they're strong, they're enforced. This idea of borderlessness or border contingency or border provisionality or even suspension or erasure, that's just fanciful. That's just humanities people doing their humanities thing. So I could see that coming from certain disciplines like political science. But I don't know. You tell me. I'd love to hear critiques, things that you're not convinced by.
Your answer to Sati reminds me of the beautiful inscription by Alberto Rios. We just turn the map, right? We just turn the map a little bit, and we see that the border is not what divides us, it's what joins us. So I am going to leave the questioning there, and we have ample time for informal conversation. The door always just magically opens and food appears. So we have time
How
to
lovely.
enjoy some refreshments together, break bread, and talk a little bit more with Beth. So please join me in giving Elizabeth Shakman Hurd a round of applause.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.